Chapter 5. The Division of the Subject. For Paul to maintain that under the condition of the Christ event, there has been a choice for things that are not against things that are, indicates in an exemplary way that in his eyes, Christian discourse bears an absolutely new relation to its object. It is truly another figure of the real that is in question. This figure will deploy itself through the revelation that what constitutes the subject in its relation to this unheard-of real is not its unity, but its division. For in reality, one subject is the weaving together of two subjective paths, which Paul names the flesh, sarx, and the spirit, pneuma. And the real, in turn, insofar as it is in some way grasped by the two paths that constitute the subject, can be inflected according to two names, death, thanatos, or life, zoe. Insofar as the real is that which is thought in a subjectivating thought, it will be possible to maintain, according to a difficult central aphorism, that to gar phronema tes sarkos thanatos, to de phronema tu pneumatos zoe, Romans 8:6, which, in spite of the difficulty of identifying death as a thought, one must not hesitate to translate as, the thought of the flesh is death, the thought of the spirit is life. After centuries during which this theme has been subjected to Platonizing, and therefore Greek amendment, it has become almost impossible to grasp what is nevertheless a crucial point. The opposition between spirit and flesh has nothing to do with the opposition between the soul and the body. That is precisely why both the one and the other are thoughts, each identifying its real through an opposed name. If, evoking his existence as a persecutor prior to the Damascus conversion, Paul can affirm that the very commandment which promised life proved to be death to me, Romans 7:10, it is because a subjective maxim is always taken up in two possible senses, according to the flesh or according to the spirit, without it being possible for any substantial distinction of the Greek kind, soul and body, thought and sensibility, to unravel the subjective weaving. It is of the essence of the Christian subject to be divided, through its fidelity to the Christ event, into two paths that affect every subject in thought. The theory of subjective division disqualifies what other discourses identify as their object. It is in the guise of the evental character of the real, the upsurge of an other object. In Greek discourse, the object is the finite cosmic totality as sojourn of thought. The real causes the philosophical desire to occupy the place allotted to you in adequate fashion, an allocation of places whose principal thought can recover. What thought identifies as properly real is a place, a sojourn, which the wise man knows it is necessary to consent to. For Paul, the Christ event, which shears and undoes the cosmic totality, is precisely what indicates the vanity of places. The real is attested to rather as the refuse from every place, there where the subject rehearses his weakness. We have become, and are now, as the refuse of the world, the offscouring of all things. 1 Corinthians 4:13. One must therefore assume the subjectivity of refuse, and it is in the face of this abasement that the object of Christian discourse suddenly appears. One will note the consonance with certain Lacanian themes concerning the ethics of the analyst. At the end of the treatment, the latter must similarly consent to occupy the position of refuse so that the analysand may endure some encounter with his or her real, by virtue of which, as Lacan notes, the analyst comes very close to saintliness. For Jewish discourse, the object is elective belonging, exceptional alliance between God and his people. The entirety of the real is marked by the seal of that alliance and is gathered and manifested through the observance of the law. The real is set out on the basis of commandment. The exception that constitutes it is conceivable only through the immemorial dimension of the law. For Paul, the Christ event is heterogeneous to the law, pure excess over every prescription, grace without concept or appropriate rite. The real can no more be what in elective exception becomes literalized in stone as timeless law, Jewish discourse, than it is what comes or returns to its place, Greek discourse. The folly of our preaching will exempt us from Greek wisdom by discontinuing the regime of places and totality. It will exempt us from the Jewish law by discontinuing observances and rites. The pure event can be reconciled neither with the natural whole nor with the imperative of the letter. For him who considers that the real is pure event, Jewish and Greek discourses no longer present, as they continue to do in the work of Levinas, the paradigm of a major difference for thought. This is the driving force behind Paul's universalist conviction that ethnic or cultural difference, of which the opposition between Greek and Jew is in his time, and in the empire as a whole, the prototype, is no longer significant with regard to the real, or to the new object that sets out a new discourse. No real distinguishes the first two discourses any longer, and their distinction collapses into rhetoric. As Paul declares, defying the evidence, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, Romans 10:12. More generally, the moment the real is identified as event, making way for the division of the subject, the figures of distinction in discourse are terminated, because the position of the real instituted by them is revealed, through the retroaction of the event, to be illusory. Similarly, for the subject divided according to the paths through which the real is grasped, that of the flesh and that of the spirit, the ethnic subjects brought about by Jewish law, just as by Greek wisdom, become disqualified to the extent that they lay claim to the perpetuation of a full or undivided subject, whose particular predicates it would be impossible to enumerate: genealogy, origin, territory, rituals, and so on. To declare the non-difference between Jew and Greek establishes Christianity's potential universality. To found the subject as division, rather than as perpetuation of a tradition, renders the subjective element adequate to this universality by terminating the predicative particularity of cultural subjects. There is no doubt that universalism, and hence the existence of any truth whatsoever, requires the destitution of established differences and the initiation of a subject divided in itself by the challenge of having nothing but the vanished event to face up to. The whole challenge is that a discourse configuring the real as pure event be consistent. Is this possible? Paul tries to pursue this path. Let us emphasize once more that since the event that he takes to identify the real is not real, because the resurrection is a fable, he is able to do so only by abolishing philosophy. This is probably what distinguishes Paul from contemporary anti-philosophers who circumscribe the real event within the realm of effective truths. Grand politics for Nietzsche, the archiscientific analytic act for Lacan, mystical aesthetics for Wittgenstein. The result is that so far as philosophy is concerned, Paul's subjective position is far more abrupt than the therapeutic approach of the moderns, who all want to cure thought from the philosophical sickness. Paul's thesis is not that philosophy is an error, a necessary illusion, a phantasm, and so forth, but that there is no longer an admissible place for its pretension. The discourse of wisdom is definitively obsolete. This is what, manufactured though it probably is symbolized by the account in the Acts of the Apostles of Paul's encounter with the Greek philosophers on the Areopagus. It seems that the philosophers burst out laughing as soon as Paul's harangue touched on the only real of any import, which is the resurrection. This Nietzschean laughter, in the sense of the Antichrist, expresses a disjunction and not an opposition. The disjunctive formula is, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. 1 Corinthians 1:25. The primacy of foolishness over wisdom and of weakness over strength commands the dissipation of the formula of mastery, without which philosophy cannot exist. Henceforth, it is no longer even possible to discuss philosophy. One must declare its effective expiration, along with that of every figure of mastery. Paul never stops telling us that the Jews are looking for signs and demanding miracles, that the Greeks are looking for wisdom and asking questions, that the Christians declare Christ crucified. To demand, to question, to declare. Such are the verbal forms proper to the three discourses, their subjective postures. If one demands signs, he who performs them in abundance becomes a master for him who demands them. If one questions philosophically, he who can reply becomes a master for the perplexed subject. But he who declares without prophetic or miraculous guarantees, without arguments or proofs, does not enter into the logic of the master. Declaration, in effect, is not affected by the emptiness of the demand wherein the master installs himself. He who declares does not attest to any lack and remains withdrawn from its fulfillment by the figure of the master. This is why it is possible for him to occupy the place of the Son. To declare an event is to become the Son of that event. That Christ is Son is emblematic of the way in which the evental declaration filiates the declarant. Philosophy knows only disciples, but a son subject is the opposite of a disciple subject because he is one whose life is beginning. The possibility of such a beginning requires that God the Father has filiated himself, that he has assumed the form of the Son. It is by consenting to the figure of the Son, as expressed by the enigmatic term sending, that the Father causes us ourselves to come forth universally as sons. The Son is he for whom nothing is lacking, for he is nothing but beginning. So through God you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir. Galatians 4:7. The Father, always particular, withdraws behind his Son's universal evidence. It is quite true that all post-evental universality equalizes sons through the dissipation of the particularity of the fathers, whence the way in which every truth is marked by an indestructible youthfulness. Later, theology will indulge in all sorts of contortions in order to establish the substantial identity of Father and Son. Paul has no interest at all in such Trinitarian questions. The anti-philosophical metaphor of the sending of the Son is enough for him, for he requires only the event, and refuses all philosophical reinscription of this pure occurrence by means of the philosophical vocabulary of substance and identity. The resurrected Son filiates all of humanity. This constitutes the uselessness of the figure of knowledge and its transmission. For Paul, the figure of knowledge is itself a figure of slavery, like that of the law. The figure of mastery is in reality a fraud. One must depose the master and found the equality of sons. The most powerful expression of this equality, necessary correlate of this universality, can be found in 1 Corinthians 3:9. We are all theou synergoi, God's co-workers. This is a magnificent maxim. Where the figure of the master breaks down, come those of the worker and of equality conjoined. All equality is that of belonging together to a work. Indubitably, those participating in a truth procedure are co-workers in its becoming. This is what the metaphor of the son designates. A son is he whom an event relieves of the law and everything related to it for the benefit of a shared egalitarian endeavor. It is nevertheless necessary to return to the event upon which everything depends, and particularly the sons, co-workers in the enterprise of truth. What must the event be for universality and equality to belong together under the aegis of the universal Son? For Paul, the event is certainly not the biography, teachings, recounting of miracles, aphorisms with a double meaning of a particular individual, to wit, Jesus. The rule that applies to the divided Christian subject and which privileges the active real of the declaration over private illumination, impersonal faith over particular exploits, also applies to Jesus. In the case of the latter, Paul once again will not deny that the Son enjoyed internal communication with the divine, that he was inhabited by unutterable utterances, and that, so far as miraculous cures, multiplication of loaves, walking on water, and other amazing feats are concerned, he was the equal of any of the charlatans that abounded in the empire's eastern provinces. He simply reminds us, even if only by deliberately neglecting to mention these extraneous virtuosities, that none of this is enough to found a new era of truth. What the particular individual named Jesus said and did is only the contingent material seized upon by the event in view of an entirely different destiny. In this sense, Jesus is neither a master nor an example. He is the name for what happens to us universally. Nietzsche, for whom Paul approaches the gospel accounts with the cynicism of a rabbi, perfectly perceived the apostles' complete indifference to the anecdotal gentleness with which these accounts are filled. For Nietzsche, this is an instance of deliberate falsification, one wherein the hatred of life and the lust for power are given free rein. The life, the example, the teaching, the death, the meaning, and the right of the entire gospel, nothing was left once this hate-obsessed counterfeiter had grasped what alone he could make use of. Not the reality, not the historical truth. Paul simply shifted the center of gravity of that entire existence beyond this existence, into the lie of the resurrected Jesus. In fact, he could make no use at all of the Redeemer's life. He needed the death on the cross and something in addition. Antichrist 42. This is not inaccurate. Like every genuine theoretician of truth, Paul, as we have seen, does not believe that there can be a historical truth. Or rather, he does not believe truth to be a matter of history, of witnessing, of memory. Nietzsche, for his part, did not believe it either, for his genealogical doctrine is in no way historical. And it is true that in Paul's eyes, without the motif of the resurrection, Christ's existence would have been of little more importance than that of any other Oriental mystic, however talented. But Nietzsche is not precise enough. When he writes that Paul needs only Christ's death, quote, and something in addition, he should emphasize that this something is not in addition to death, that it is for Paul the unique point of the real onto which his thought fastens, and thus that if he shifted the center of gravity of that, Christ's, entire existence beyond this existence, it is neither in accordance with death nor in accordance with hate. but in accordance with a principle of over-existence, on the basis of which life, affirmative life, was restored and refounded for all. Does not Nietzsche himself want to shift the center of gravity of men's life beyond their contemporary nihilist decadence? And does he not require for this operation three closely related themes of which Paul is the inventor, to wit, that of the self-legitimating subjective declaration, the character of Zarathustra, the breaking of history in two, grand politics, and the new man as the end of guilty slavery and affirmation of life, the overman. If Nietzsche is so violent toward Paul, it is because he is his rival far more than his opponent, the result being that he falsifies Paul at least as much as, if not more than, Paul falsified Jesus. To say that Nietzsche shifted the center of gravity of life out of life into the beyond, into nothingness, and that in so doing, he deprived life, as such, of its center of gravity, Antichrist 43, is to maintain the very opposite of the apostles' teaching, for whom it is here and now that life takes revenges on death, here and now that we can live affirmatively, according to the Spirit, rather than negatively, according to the flesh, which is the thought of death. For Paul, the resurrection is that on the basis of which life's center of gravity resides in life, whereas previously, being situated in the law, it organized life's subsumption by death. In reality, the core of the problem is that Nietzsche harbors a genuine loathing for universalism. Not always. This mad saint is a violent living contradiction, a breaking in two of himself. But where Paul is concerned, yes. Quote, "The poison of the doctrine, equal rights for all. This has been more thoroughly sowed by Christianity than by anything else." Antichrist 43. Where God is concerned, Nietzsche extols the virtues of the most obstinate particularism, the most unbridled racial communitarianism. Formerly, he, God, represented a people, the strength of a people, everything aggressive and thirsting for power in the soul of a people. There is, in fact, no other alternative for gods. Either they are the will to power, and so long as they are that, they will be national gods, or else the impotence for power. Antichrist 16. What Nietzsche, on this point remaining a German mythologue, in Labart's sense of the term, cannot forgive Paul for is not so much to have willed nothingness, but to have rid us of these sinister national gods, and to have formulated a theory of a subject who, as Nietzsche admirably, albeit disgustedly, puts it, is universally a rebel against everything privileged. Antichrist 46. Moreover, while protesting against Paul in the name of historical truth, Nietzsche does not seem to have appropriately situated the apostles' preaching relative to the canonical shape of the gospel narratives. He pays little attention to the fact that these narratives, wherein he claims to discern the psychology of the Redeemer, a Buddha of decadence, a partisan of the quiet, empty life, the last man, were composed and organized long after Paul fiercely seized upon the only point that is supernumerary relative to this Buddhist edification, the resurrection. But nothing is more indispensable than to keep in mind the temporal relation between the synoptic Gospels, in which the edifying anecdote is essential, and Paul's epistles, charged from beginning to end with the revolutionary announcement of a spiritual history that has been broken in two. The Gospels literally come 20 years later. The Pauline reference is of a different substance. The event is not a teaching. Christ is not a master. Disciples are out of the question. Jesus is certainly Lord, Kurios, and Paul is his servant, doulos. But the Christ event establishes the authority of a new subjective path over future eras. The fact that we must serve a truth procedure is not to be confused with slavery, which is precisely that from which we are forever released insofar as we all become sons of what has happened to us. The relation between Lord and servant differs absolutely from that between master and disciple, as well as from that between owner and slave. It is not a relation of personal or legal dependence. It is a community of destiny in that moment in which we have to become a new creature. That is why we need retain of Christ only what ordains this destiny, which is indifferent to the particularities of the living person. Jesus is resurrected. Nothing else matters, so that Jesus becomes like an anonymous variable, a someone devoid of predicative traits, entirely absorbed by his resurrection. The pure event is reducible to this: Jesus died on the cross and resurrected. This event is grace, charis. Thus, it is neither a bequest, nor a tradition, nor a teaching. It is supernumerary relative to all this, and presents itself as pure givenness. As subject to the ordeal of the real, we are henceforth constituted by evental grace. The crucial formula, which it must be noted is simultaneously a universal address, is ou gar este hupo nomon al hupocharin. For you are not under law, but under grace. Romans 6:14. A structuring of the subject according to a not but, through which it must be understood as a becoming rather than a state. For the not being under law negatively indicates the path of the flesh as suspension of the subject's destiny, while being under grace indicates the path of the Spirit as fidelity to the event. The subject of the new epoch is a not but. The event is at once the suspension of the path of the flesh through a problematic not, and the affirmation of the path of the Spirit through a but of exception. Law and grace are for the subject the name of the constituting weave through which he is related to the situation as it is, and to the effects of the event as they have to become. We shall maintain, in effect, that an evental rupture always constitutes its subject in the divided form of a not but, and that it is precisely this form that bears the universal. For the not is the potential dissolution of closed particularities, whose name is law, while the but indicates the task, the faithful labor in which the subjects of the process opened up by the event, whose name is grace, are the co-workers. The universal is neither on the side of the flesh as conventional lawfulness and particular state of the world, nor on the side of the pure spirit as private inhabitation by grace and truth. The Jewish discourse of the right and the law is undermined by the event's superabundance. But equally, the arrogant discourse of internal revelation and the unutterable is abolished. The second and fourth discourses must be revoked because they unify the subject. Only the third discourse holds to its division as a guarantee of universality. If the event is able to enter into the constitution of the subject declaring it, it is precisely because through it, and irrespective of the particularity of persons, it ceaselessly redivides the two paths, distributing the not but, which through an endless process sets aside the law, the better to enter into grace.